Breaking news tonight. The Supreme Court out with this ruling on the Trump administration and passports. They're now saying that the Trump administration can force people to ID themselves on passports based on their sex at birth, meaning male or female would be the only options. Critics tonight call that a major blow to transgender rights. The court writing in the order that displaying passport holders' sex at birth no more offends equal protection principles than displaying their country of birth. In both cases, they write, the government is merely attesting to a historical fact without subjecting anyone to differential.
Supreme Court justices appear skeptical of President Trump's authority to impose tariffs on countries across the world. Justices heard arguments yesterday over the president's sweeping levies, and this case could have major economic impacts on consumers and businesses, as well as the scope of presidential power.
Okay, so picture this. You're watching a live political event. Cameras are rolling. The room is full of politicians, judges, dignitaries. Donald Trump is speaking, and he starts talking about his presidential powers, about what he believes he should be able to do. And then he says something shocking, something that goes beyond his usual bombast. He says, being president means I get to do whatever I want, and judges should just rubber stamp my decisions, just rubber stamp them, no questions, no review, no checks on his power, just automatic approval of whatever Trump decides to do. And the room goes silent. People look at each other. Is he serious? Did he really just say that? And then movement. A Supreme Court justice sitting in the audience stands up, doesn't say anything, just stands up and walks out right in the middle of Trump's speech with cameras capturing everything. The justice walks out of the room, a silent but powerful statement, a rejection of Trump's claim that he can do whatever he wants, a defense of judicial independence and the Constitution, and the moment goes viral. Within minutes, the video is everywhere. Social media explodes. News outlets are covering it nonstop. Legal experts are calling it unprecedented. Politicians on both sides are reacting, and America is witnessing something it's never seen before. A sitting Supreme Court justice publicly walking out on a president who just insulted the Constitution. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
And always with real limits, they say. Now, on the Trump administration side, Solicitor General John Sauer argued that the tariffs are not taxes. He said these are regulatory tools that are directed at foreign affairs. This is an area, Errol, where the president has broad authority. And in fact, he says these are regulatory tariffs, not revenue-raising tariffs. And the fact that they raise revenue, he said, is only incidental. In fact, Errol, he said the tariffs would be most effective if no one ever paid them.
This is wild. This is absolutely unprecedented because Supreme Court justices don't do things like this. They maintain decorum. They avoid public political confrontations. They stay above the fray. But Trump's statement was so outrageous, so offensive to the constitutional order that a justice felt compelled to walk out, to make a public statement without saying a word, to show that Trump's view of presidential power is unacceptable, unconstitutional, dangerous. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what Trump said, why it's so problematic, why the justice walked out, and what this means for the separation of powers and constitutional government in America. Because trust me, this is huge. This is a Supreme Court justice publicly rebuking a president, defending the Constitution against Trump's authoritarian impulses, and sending a message that the judiciary won't accept Trump's attempt to place himself above the law. Now, Trump's statement that being president means I get to do whatever I want and judges should just rubber stamp my decisions reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how American government works, or more likely, a deliberate rejection of constitutional limits on presidential power. The Constitution creates three co-equal branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each with its own powers and responsibilities, and each serving as a check on the others. The president doesn't get to do whatever he wants. The president's powers are limited by the Constitution, by laws passed by Congress, and by judicial review. The Supreme Court and other federal courts have the power to review presidential actions, to determine if they're constitutional, to strike them down if they're not. That's judicial review. It's been a fundamental part of American constitutional law since Marbury v. Madison in 1803, and it's essential to preventing tyranny, to ensuring that no branch of government becomes too powerful. So when Trump says judges should just rubber stamp his decisions, he's rejecting judicial review. He's saying courts shouldn't actually review whether his actions are legal or constitutional. They should just automatically approve whatever he does. And that's not how the system works. That's not what the Constitution requires. In fact, it's the opposite of what the Constitution requires. Judges take an oath to uphold the Constitution, to apply the law faithfully, to protect constitutional rights and limits on government power. They can't just rubber stamp presidential decisions. They have to actually review them, actually determine if they're lawful. And if they're not, judges have a duty to say so, to strike down unconstitutional actions. Even if the president doesn't like it, that's their job. And Trump is essentially saying they shouldn't do their job, that they should just defer to him, let him do whatever he wants. And that's authoritarian. That's the thinking of a dictator, not a democratic president. So when Trump said this, he crossed the line. He didn't just criticize a particular court decision. He didn't just disagree with judges. He attacked the fundamental principle of judicial review. He suggested that judges should abandon their constitutional role and just approve his actions. And the Supreme Court justice heard this and decided it was so offensive, so dangerous, that a response was necessary. Not a verbal response, not a statement, but a physical demonstration, walking out, leaving the room while Trump was still speaking, a silent but powerful rebuke. Now, we don't know which justice walked out. The reports don't identify them. It could have been a liberal justice who's been critical of Trump, or it could have been a conservative justice who respects institutional norms and constitutional principles even while supporting conservative policies. Either way, the walkout is significant because it shows that Trump's statement crossed the line that even judges who might generally support him can't accept, that there are principles, constitutional principles about separation of powers and judicial independence that transcend politics. And when a president attacks those principles, when he suggests judges should just rubber stamp his decisions, that's intolerable. That requires a response. And the justice provided one, a wordless, dignified, powerful response, walking out, and the impact has been enormous. Legal experts are calling it one of the most disrespectful and explosive moments in modern political history. Not the justice's walkout. Trump's statement, Trump insulting the Constitution. Trump suggesting he should be able to do whatever he wants without judicial review. That's what's disrespectful. That's what's explosive. And legal scholars are warning that Trump has crossed a red line, that even his allies should condemn this statement because it attacks the foundation of American constitutional government. And judges are taking notice. They're increasingly concerned about Trump's attacks on judicial independence, about his attempts to intimidate judges, about his rhetoric suggesting that judges who rule against him are enemies. And this walkout signals that judges are prepared to push back, to defend their independence, to resist Trump's authoritarian impulses. So yeah, this is the story. Supreme Court justice walking out after Trump insults the Constitution live, Trump claiming he should be able to do whatever he wants, judges should rubber stamp his decisions, a justice responding by walking out, and America witnessing an unprecedented confrontation between the executive and judicial branches. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into why Trump's statement is so dangerous and why the justices' walkout matters. Because this isn't just about one offensive comment. This is about fundamental principles of constitutional government, about separation of powers, about judicial independence, and about whether America remains a democracy or slides toward authoritarianism. Let's start with the constitutional framework. The United States Constitution creates a system of separated powers. The founders deliberately divided government power among three branches to prevent any one person or institution from becoming too powerful. The legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces laws, and the judicial branch interprets laws and reviews government actions to ensure they comply with the Constitution. And critically, each branch serves as a check on the others. Congress can pass laws limiting presidential power. The president can veto legislation. Courts can strike down unconstitutional laws or executive actions. The president appoints judges, but the Senate must confirm them. This system of checks and balances prevents tyranny. It ensures that no branch can act without limits, that power is distributed and constrained. And judicial review, the power of courts to review government actions and strike down those that violate the Constitution, is central to this system. Without judicial review, without courts actually checking presidential power, the president becomes unconstrained, can do whatever they want. And that's exactly what Trump is suggesting should happen. He's saying judges should just approve his decisions, should rubber stamp them without real review, and that would destroy the separation of powers, would eliminate the judiciary as a meaningful check on executive power. Now, let's talk about judicial independence. For courts to serve as a check on presidential power, they need to be independent. Judges need to be able to rule against the president without fear of retaliation, without worrying that the president will attack them, threaten them, or try to remove them from office. That's why federal judges have life tenure. Once appointed and confirmed, they serve for life unless they retire or are impeached. That protects them from political pressure, allows them to make decisions based on law and constitution, not based on what the president wants. And that independence is essential to rule of law. to ensuring that laws apply to everyone, even presidents. That power is constrained by law, not by whoever holds office. But Trump has been attacking judicial independence throughout his presidency. He attacks judges who rule against him, calls them biased, corrupt, enemies. He suggests judges who don't support him should be removed. He threatens to prosecute judges after he leaves office, and now he's explicitly saying judges should just rubber stamp his decisions, should abandon their role of actually reviewing presidential actions. That's a direct attack on judicial independence, and it's dangerous, because if judges start making decisions based on fear of presidential retaliation rather than based on law, then rule of law collapses. Laws become whatever the president says they are, and that's authoritarianism, not democracy. Now, Trump's statement also reveals his view of presidential power. Trump believes, or at least claims to believe, that being president means he can do whatever he wants, that presidential power is essentially unlimited, that judges shouldn't constrain him, that he's above the law, and that view is fundamentally inconsistent with constitutional democracy. The Constitution limits presidential power. It specifies what presidents can do, and it reserves other powers to Congress or to the states. Presidents can't just do whatever they want. They have to act within constitutional limits, and courts enforce those limits. But Trump rejects that framework. He sees the presidency as essentially a monarchy, where the president's will is law, where checks and balances are obstacles to be overcome rather than essential features of the system. And Trump has acted consistently with that view. He's issued executive orders that courts have struck down as unconstitutional. He's claimed emergency powers that don't exist. He's refused to comply with congressional subpoenas. He's attacked anyone who tries to hold him accountable. All of it reflecting this belief that he can do whatever he wants. In his statement that judges should rubber stamp his decisions makes that belief explicit. He's not even pretending to respect constitutional limits anymore. He's openly saying that he should be able to do whatever he wants, and judges should just approve it. Now let's talk about why a Supreme Court justice walked out. Because justices don't typically make public political statements. They maintain neutrality. They avoid partisan controversies. They express their views through opinions, not through public demonstrations. But Trump's statement was so offensive to constitutional principles that a justice felt compelled to respond, to make a statement without words, to show that Trump's view of presidential power is unacceptable. And the walkout accomplishes several things. First, it's a defense of judicial independence. The justice is saying, no, we won't just rubber stamp your decisions. We have a constitutional duty to review your actions, to strike them down if they're unlawful, and we won't abandon that duty just because you demand it. Second, it's a rebuke of Trump's authoritarianism. The justice is showing that Trump's statement crossed the line, that suggesting presidents can do whatever they want is intolerable, that constitutional limits on power matter. Third, it's a signal to other judges. The walkout shows that Supreme Court justices recognize the threat Trump poses to judicial independence, and it encourages other judges to stand firm, to resist pressure, to continue doing their jobs regardless of Trump's attacks. Fourth, it's a message to the American people. The walkout shows that even Supreme Court justices, who normally stay above political fray, see Trump's statement as so dangerous that a response is necessary, that constitutional government is at stake, and that citizens should pay attention. Now, the reaction to Trump's statement and the justices' walkout has been enormous. Legal experts are condemning Trump's statement. Constitutional scholars are warning that Trump's view of presidential power threatens democracy. Former officials, including some who served under Republican presidents, are saying Trump has gone too far, that even his allies should condemn this attack on constitutional principles. Because if Trump can do whatever he wants, if judges just rubber stamp his decisions, then America isn't a constitutional democracy anymore. It's an autocracy. And even Republicans who support Trump's policies should oppose that, should defend constitutional limits on power. Because those limits protect everyone. They prevent any president, Democrat, or Republican from becoming a tyrant. Some Republicans are defending Trump, claiming he was taken out of context, or that his statement wasn't meant literally, but the statement is pretty clear. Trump said he should be able to do whatever he wants, and judges should rubber stamp his decisions. That's not ambiguous. That's a direct statement of his view of presidential power, and it's indefensible. Democrats are using Trump's statement to highlight the danger he poses. They're arguing that Trump doesn't respect constitutional limits, that he sees himself as above the law, that re-electing him would threaten American democracy. In Trump's own words, captured on video, support that argument. Within the judiciary, there's growing concern. Judges have been watching Trump's attacks on judicial independence, his threats against judges who rule against him, his suggestions that courts should defer to him, and now this explicit statement that judges should rubber stamp his decisions. And judges are worried. They're concerned that Trump is trying to intimidate them, to pressure them into ruling in his favor, to undermine their independence. The walkout shows that at least one Supreme Court justice has had enough. that Trump's attack on judicial review crossed the line, and it suggests that other judges might be prepared to push back more publicly if Trump continues attacking the judiciary. Now let's connect this to Trump's broader assault on institutions, because Trump's statement about judges rubber stamping his decisions is part of a larger pattern. Trump attacks any institution that constrains his power. He attacks the press when they criticize him, calls them enemies of the people. He attacks law enforcement when they investigate him, claims they're politically motivated. He attacks Congress when they exercise oversight, refuses to comply with subpoenas, claims executive privilege even when it doesn't apply. He attacks the intelligence community when they provide information he doesn't like, claims they're part of a deep state conspiracy. And he attacks courts when they rule against him, claims judges are biased, suggests they should be removed, and now explicitly says they should just approve whatever he does. This pattern is dangerous because democracy depends on institutions that can check executive power, free press, independent judiciary, professional law enforcement, Congress exercising oversight. When presidents attack these institutions, when they try to undermine public trust in them, they're weakening the foundations of democracy. They're creating conditions where authoritarian rule becomes possible. And Trump's statement about rubber stamping is particularly concerning because it's not just attacking judges who ruled against him in specific cases. It's attacking the entire concept of judicial review, the entire role of courts in our constitutional system. If Trump succeeds in convincing his supporters that courts shouldn't check presidential power, that judges should just approve whatever presidents do, then one of the most important safeguards against tyranny is gone. So yeah, this is where we are. Trump publicly stating that judges should rubber stamp his decisions, a Supreme Court justice walking out in protest, legal experts warning that constitutional democracy is under threat, and America facing a fundamental question about whether it will remain a nation governed by law or become one where the president's will is supreme. Let's talk about what this means going forward. Okay, so let's break down what Trump's statement and the justices walkout mean for American democracy, for the judiciary, and for Trump's presidency. Because this isn't just a symbolic moment, this is a confrontation over fundamental principles that will shape American government for years to come. First, let's talk about what this means for the judiciary. Judges are now on notice that Trump views their role as rubber stamping his decisions rather than actually reviewing them, and they have to decide how to respond. Some judges will be intimidated. They'll worry about Trump's attacks, about being targeted on social media, about facing political pressure, and they might be more deferential to Trump as a result, more willing to uphold his actions even when constitutionally questionable. But other judges will resist. They'll see Trump's statement as a reason to be more vigilant, to scrutinize his actions more carefully, to ensure they're doing their constitutional duty of checking executive power. The justices' walkout signals that at least some members of the Supreme Court fall into this second category. They're not going to be intimidated, they're going to do their jobs. And Trump's attacks will make them more determined, not less. So we're likely to see increased judicial pushback against Trump, more rulings striking down his executive actions, more opinions emphasizing constitutional limits on presidential power, more judges publicly defending judicial independence, and that's going to create more conflict between Trump and the judiciary, more attacks from Trump, more defenses from judges, an escalating confrontation over the role of courts in our constitutional system. Second, let's talk about what this means for separation of powers. Trump's statement reveals that he doesn't accept the constitutional framework of separated powers with checks and balances. He wants unchecked executive power. He wants to be able to do whatever he wants without judicial review, and that's a fundamental threat to constitutional democracy. If Congress and the courts don't push back, if they allow Trump to act without constraint, then separation of powers becomes meaningless. The presidency becomes an elected monarchy, and constitutional government collapses. So other branches need to respond. Congress needs to exercise its oversight powers, needs to hold Trump accountable for overreach, needs to defend its own constitutional role. Courts need to continue reviewing Trump's actions, striking down those that exceed constitutional authority, defending the rule of law, and citizens need to demand that their representatives defend constitutional government, need to vote for people who will check presidential power rather than enable it. The justice walkout is one example of institutional pushback, but more is needed. All branches and citizens need to defend the constitutional structure that prevents tyranny. Third, let's talk about the political implications. Trump's statement is going to be used against him politically. Democrats will point to it as evidence that Trump doesn't respect constitutional limits, that he's authoritarian, that he's dangerous to democracy, and that's powerful messaging, because Trump said it himself on camera. There's no ambiguity or interpretation needed. Trump's own words show his view of presidential power, and voters who care about constitutional government, who believe in separation of powers and checks and balances, should be alarmed by that. Even some Republicans who support Trump's policies should be troubled by this statement, because constitutional limits on power protect everyone. They prevent any president from becoming a tyrant, and Trump explicitly rejecting those limits should concern anyone who values constitutional democracy. Fourth, let's talk about the normalization of authoritarian rhetoric. Trump has been attacking democratic institutions and norms throughout his political career, and at first, each attack was shocking. But over time, people have become desensitized. Trump's attacks on the press, on judges, on law enforcement, they've become normalized. Expected, not shocking anymore. And that's dangerous, because it shifts the Overton window. It makes authoritarian behavior seem normal, acceptable, just Trump being Trump. But statements like this, where Trump explicitly says judges should rubber stamp his decisions, should shock us, should remind us that Trump's view of presidential power is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy. The justices' walkout helps with that. It signals that Trump's statement isn't normal, isn't acceptable, it's offensive to constitutional principles, and it should be treated as such. Fifth, let's talk about historical precedent. Because America has faced presidents who tried to exceed constitutional limits before, but usually, when presidents go too far, institutions push back, courts strike down unconstitutional actions, Congress exercises oversight, the press exposes abuses, and either the president corrects course or they face consequences. Nixon tried to exceed constitutional limits, and he was forced to resign. Other presidents who overreached faced court defeats, congressional investigations, and political backlash. The system worked to constrain them, but Trump is testing whether the system still works, whether institutions can still constrain a president who openly rejects constitutional limits, who attacks anyone who tries to hold him accountable, who demands that judges rubber stamp his decisions, and the answer will determine the future of American democracy. If institutions hold firm, if they continue checking presidential power despite Trump's attacks, then the system survives, constitutional government continues. But if institutions cave, if judges start deferring to Trump out of fear, if Congress fails to exercise oversight, if the press is intimidated into silence, then constitutional democracy erodes. Presidential power becomes unchecked, and America slides toward authoritarianism. 6. Let's talk about what citizens should do, because ultimately, democracy depends on citizens, on voters holding their representatives accountable, on people demanding that government respects constitutional principles. So citizens need to pay attention to moments like this. When Trump says judges should rubber stamp his decisions, that should matter. That should inform voting decisions, should motivate people to demand that their representatives defend constitutional government. Citizens should support judicial independence, should defend judges when Trump attacks them, should make clear that courts must remain independent checks on presidential power. Citizens should demand congressional oversight, should insist that Congress exercises constitutional role regardless of which party controls it, should vote for representatives who will check executive overreach, and citizens should stay engaged, should remain vigilant about attacks on democratic institutions, should refuse to let authoritarian rhetoric become normalized. The justices' walkout is a reminder that defending constitutional democracy requires action, requires people to stand up for principles even when it's uncomfortable, even when it creates conflict. And citizens need to do the same. So what's the bottom line? Trump publicly stated that being president means he can do whatever he wants, and judges should rubber stamp his decisions. That statement attacks the foundation of American constitutional government. It rejects judicial review. It demands unchecked presidential power. It's authoritarian. A Supreme Court justice responded by walking out. A silent but powerful statement defending judicial independence and constitutional principles. The confrontation has sparked national debate about presidential power, separation of powers, and the health of American democracy. Legal experts are condemning Trump's statement. Judges are increasingly concerned about attacks on judicial independence, and citizens are watching to see whether institutions will hold firm or whether constitutional constraints on presidential power will erode. This is a defining moment, a test of whether American constitutional democracy can survive a president who explicitly rejects its fundamental principles, whether institutions will defend their roles, whether citizens will demand accountability. The justice walkout shows that at least some officials are prepared to stand up for constitutional principles, but more resistance is needed, from courts, from Congress, from citizens, because Trump has made clear he doesn't respect constitutional limits. And if we want to preserve constitutional democracy, we need to defend it actively, firmly, continuously. Stay tuned, because this confrontation is just beginning, and its outcome will shape American democracy for generations.